My husband's laughter echoed from our bedroom as I returned home early from a business trip. "Babe, check what I bought for us," a woman's voice purred. I stood frozen in our hallway, wedding photos staring down at me from walls he didn't know I had paid for. When he emerged and saw me, his face drained of color. "Emily, you're home early." Behind him stood a blonde wearing my silk robe. Neither realized that in 3 minutes, I would be the only one legally allowed to remain in that house. Before, we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The trip from the airport should have taken 40 minutes, but a canceled connecting flight put me home 6 hours earlier than expected. As the rideshare pulled into our driveway, I noticed an unfamiliar red convertible parked where my car usually stood. Probably one of the neighbors having work done on their driveway, I reasoned, too exhausted from back-to-back client presentations to give it much thought. Our colonial-style home looked exactly as I had left it 5 days ago. Meticulous landscaping, tasteful exterior lighting I had selected during the renovation last spring, and the pale blue door I had insisted upon despite Richard's preference for traditional black. The home represented everything I had worked for since graduating law school with honors and accepting a junior partnership at Kelman & Associates 7 years ago. The security system disarmed with my fingerprint, allowing me to enter silently. I slipped off my heels in the foyer, planning to surprise Richard. That's when I heard them. The unmistakable sounds of intimacy coming from upstairs, punctuated by my husband's distinctive laugh, the one reserved for moments of genuine happiness that had become increasingly rare in our marriage. "Babe, check what I bought for us." A woman's voice carried down the stairwell, followed by Richard's appreciative whistle. My body responded before my mind could process what was happening. Blood rushing in my ears, a cold sweat breaking across my forehead, my stomach contracting so violently I had to brace myself against the wall. The wall I had insisted on keeping when the contractor suggested removing it to create an open floor plan. The wall where we had hung our wedding photos, now witnessing my humiliation. I stood paralyzed in that hallway, unable to move toward the confrontation awaiting me upstairs or retreat through the door behind me. 3 years of marriage condensed into this single, clarifying moment of betrayal. Not just any betrayal, one happening in my home, in my bed, with a woman comfortable enough to call my husband babe and discuss purchases as if she belonged there. The creak of our bedroom door opening upstairs jolted me back to awareness. Footsteps approached the staircase, Richard's familiar gait, the slight drag of his left foot from an old college soccer injury. "Emily, you're home early." His voice carried equal measures of shock and panic as he spotted me from the landing. He wore nothing but hastily donned sweatpants, his chest still flushed. Behind him appeared a woman I had never seen before, tall, blonde, significantly younger than my 34 years, and wearing my silk kimono robe, an anniversary gift I had bought for myself when Richard forgot our second anniversary. "What is this?" I asked, my lawyer's composure taking over when emotional systems threatened to shut down completely. "I can explain," Richard started, coming down several steps before stopping, as if uncertain whether to approach me or retreat to the woman who now looked more amused than concerned. "Alexis is a colleague. We've been working on a project together. And—" "Save it," I interrupted, my voice steadier than I felt. I turned to the woman, Alexis, who had the audacity to lean casually against my banister. "That's a beautiful robe. Where did you get it?" Confusion crossed her face before she responded with unearned confidence. "Richard bought it for me. He has excellent taste." A bitter laugh escaped me before I could contain it. Richard had excellent taste indeed in selecting gifts I had purchased for myself to give to his mistress. "Actually, I bought that robe at Neiman Marcus last year. The receipt is probably still in my files since I claimed it as a business expense after Richard forgot. Our anniversary And I had to attend a client dinner looking like someone who wasn't questioning her life choices. Richard blanched, glancing between us. Emily, let's talk about this privately. Alexis, maybe you should… Alexis isn't going anywhere yet, I said, my attorney instincts fully activated now. I'd like to understand exactly what's happening in my home. Our home, Richard corrected automatically. Interesting you should say that, I replied, setting down my carry-on bag and removing my phone from my blazer pocket. Let's clarify some details. I opened my banking app, navigating to the mortgage documents while maintaining eye contact with Richard. His expression shifted from defensive to uncertain as he recognized my professional demeanor emerging. What he used to call my courtroom face with equal measures of pride and intimidation early in our relationship. The deed to this property is solely in my name, Richard. The mortgage is solely in my name. The property taxes, insurance, and all renovation costs have been paid from my personal accounts, not our joint account. That's just a technicality, he stammered, his confidence visibly deteriorating. We agreed. We agreed you would transfer funds to cover half the expenses, which stopped happening 14 months ago when you claimed your commission structure changed. I covered the difference because you assured me it was temporary. Alexis's smug expression had transformed to confusion, her eyes darting between us as she clutched my robe tighter around her body. Richard, what is she talking about? You said… This was your house. You said your wife was the problem, spending all your money never appreciating what you provide. The irony was so profound I almost pitied her. Almost. The problem, I explained with measured calm, is that Richard has been living in a fantasy where he's the provider, when in reality, I've been carrying our financial responsibilities while he's been… I gestured vaguely between them, allocating his resources elsewhere. Richard's face flushed with anger now, embarrassment transforming to defensiveness. You're twisting everything. Yes, you make more than me, but I contribute in other ways. This house is as much mine as yours. We're married. A marriage that apparently includes you moving your girlfriend into my home without my knowledge or consent. I haven't moved in, Alexis interjected, looking increasingly uncomfortable. I just stay over sometimes when you're traveling. 3 nights this week, I countered. Your clothes are in my closet. Your toiletries are in my bathroom. Your car is in my driveway. That constitutes living here in every practical sense. Richard descended the remaining stairs, attempting to regain control of the situation. Emily, you're overreacting. Alexis and I have become close, but we were going to talk to you about it. We're all adults here. Adults who understand property. Law? I asked, my professional training providing stability amid emotional chaos. Because as the sole owner of this property, I have certain rights that you seem to have overlooked, including the right to determine who lives here. The magnitude of his miscalculation was finally registering on Richard's face. 3 years ago, when we purchased this house, he had been between jobs, another commission-based position that hadn't worked out. His credit score had been damaged by late payments on the sports car he insisted on leasing. The mortgage officer had suggested putting the loan solely in my name to secure better terms, with the understanding that we would refinance later to add Richard. That refinancing never happened. At first because interest rates rose, then because Richard insisted we prioritize renovations over paperwork, and finally because I began noticing discrepancies in our financial arrangements, unexplained expenses, missed contributions to joint accounts, vague explanations about commission delays. You wouldn't throw me out, Richard said, his voice lacking conviction. We need to discuss this rationally. I've been rational for 3 years, Richard. I've been rational while watching my bank account drain to support your lifestyle. I've been rational while you've missed mortgage payments that I've quietly covered. I've been rational while you've lied about working late when apparently you were building a relationship with Alexis. You're never home, he countered, desperation edging into his voice. Always traveling for work, always prioritizing your career over our marriage. What did you expect? Basic decency, I replied. Simply, honesty, respect for our home if not for me. Alexis shifted uncomfortably, the reality of her situation becoming clearer. Richard, you said she was never here. You said she was probably cheating too, with her colleagues. Projection is a powerful psychological mechanism, I noted. When someone accuses you of exactly what they're doing, it's rarely coincidental. My phone buzzed with a notification, a colleague confirming our meeting tomorrow to discuss the Harrison acquisition. The mundane professional reminder created a surreal contrast to the personal catastrophe unfolding in my foyer. My marriage was imploding, yet tomorrow I would still need to review contract terms and negotiate favorable conditions for my client. The absurdity of this juxtaposition triggered unexpected clarity. For years, I had compartmentalized my growing concerns about Richard's behavior, focusing instead on professional achievements and financial stability. I had accepted his increasingly transparent excuses because acknowledging the truth would require action, disruption, confrontation. All things my conflict-averse nature resisted. But now, with the evidence literally wearing my anniversary robe, compartmentalization was no longer possible. Here's what's going to happen, I said, summoning the same authoritative tone I used when opponents attempted to undermine my position in negotiations. You both have 30 minutes to collect your personal belongings and leave. Richard, you can take anything that's demonstrably yours. Clothing, personal effects, items you purchased with documentation. Anything purchased with joint funds or my separate funds remains here. You can't be serious, Richard sputtered. Where am I supposed to go? Perhaps to wherever Alexis lives, I suggested. Since you've been comfortable enough to move her into my home, I assume she can extend the same courtesy. Alexis's expression confirmed this wasn't a welcome proposition. My roommate wouldn't. Not my concern, I interrupted. My only concern is reclaiming my property and privacy. This is ridiculous. Richard attempted one last stand. I'm not leaving my own house because you're having some kind of emotional breakdown. We need to talk about this like rational people. I set my phone on the console table and met his gaze directly. Richard, I am being extraordinarily rational. I'm the legal owner of this property. Your name appears nowhere on any documentation related to this house. If you refuse to leave voluntarily, I will call the police and report you for trespassing. I will then file for an emergency restraining order citing this incident, which will prevent you from returning to the property until our divorce proceedings determine final asset distribution. The word divorce landed with finality between us. Until I spoke it aloud, some part of me hadn't fully accepted that our marriage had reached this irrevocable endpoint. But standing in that hallway, confronting not just Richard's infidelity, but the cumulative deceptions of our relationship, I recognized that this moment wasn't creating a new reality. It was simply revealing the truth that had existed beneath our carefully maintained facade. You wouldn't, Richard challenged, though his body language betrayed his understanding that I absolutely would. 27 minutes remaining, I replied, checking my watch. I suggest you use them efficiently. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. My name is Emily Chen, 34 years old, senior associate at Kelman & Associates, specializing in corporate mergers and acquisitions, and apparently soon-to-be ex-wife of Richard Denton, who had just been caught bringing another woman into our home with the casual entitlement of a man who believed he owned everything his wife had built. As the front door closed behind Richard and Alexis, 29 minutes after my ultimatum, I remained standing in the foyer, briefcase still at my feet, the silence of the house pressing against me with unfamiliar weight. In the span of less than an hour, I had transformed from a woman returning home to her husband into something else entirely. Not yet divorced, but no longer truly married. Not quite victimized, but unmistakably betrayed. Richard had departed with considerably less than he'd anticipated. His attempt to remove our shared television had been met with a calm recitation of the credit card statement showing my payment for it. His claim to the guest room furniture was countered with documentation from my design consultant. By the end, he had retreated with 2 hastily packed suitcases, a golf bag, and the humiliation of watching Alexis realize exactly what kind of man she'd become involved with. "He told me you were separated," she had whispered, while Richard ransacked his closet upstairs. "He said you were divorcing but keeping it quiet for your career. And yet my clothes still hang in the closet," I had responded, neither accusatory nor sympathetic. "My toiletries remain in the bathroom, my mail arrives daily." "I feel so stupid," she admitted, having changed from my robe into her own clothes. She couldn't meet my eyes. "We believe what we need to believe," I said simply, "but perhaps reconsider what you need going forward." Now, in the aftermath of their departure, I moved methodically through the house, cataloging evidence of Alexis's presence I had initially missed. A second toothbrush in the master bathroom, unfamiliar perfume on the vanity, a charger for a phone model I didn't own, women's magazines I never read stacked on what had once been Richard's nightstand. In our shared office, I discovered more disturbing signs. Financial documents moved from their organized files, my laptop showing recent searches for divorce attorneys in our area. Richard had been planning his exit strategy while simultaneously installing his girlfriend in my home. The calculated duplicity suggested a depth of betrayal beyond mere infidelity, a comprehensive campaign to secure his position before revealing his true intentions. Opening my home safe, the combination being my maternal grandmother's birth date, something Richard had always struggled to remember, I confirmed my passport, birth certificate, and investment documents remained undisturbed. At least his plotting hadn't extended to identity theft, though the invaded privacy of our home suddenly made everything feel vulnerable. I poured myself a glass of the Bordeaux I'd been saving for a special occasion. Discovering your husband's infidelity in the most visceral way possible certainly qualified as an occasion, if not precisely special. Carrying the glass to my back patio, I sank into a cushioned chair and faced the unfolding reality of my situation. What had I wanted from this marriage? Security, partnership, the validation that comes from building a life with someone who values your success as their own. Standing in my way now was the brutal truth that these desires had been largely unreciprocated, that, while I had been celebrating Richard's small victories and compensating for his financial shortfalls, he had been constructing a parallel narrative where my achievements somehow victimized him. My phone buzzed with incoming texts from Richard. "This is completely unreasonable. We need to talk when you've calmed down. You can't just throw away 3 years of marriage without discussion. I'm willing to work through this if you are." Alexis was a mistake. The audacity of positioning himself as the reasonable party, willing to forgive my overreaction to his mistake, would have been laughable if it weren't so painfully predictable. Richard had always excelled at emotional manipulation, casting himself as the wounded party even when he was unmistakably the aggressor. It was a quality I had initially misinterpreted as sensitivity, then later accepted as an occasional annoyance. Now I recognized it as the foundation of our dysfunctional dynamic. I didn't respond to his texts. Instead, I scrolled through my contacts until I found Jessica Rothman's number. As both my law school friend and the firm's most respected divorce attorney, she represented exactly the clear-headed counsel I needed. The call went to voicemail, unsurprising at 9:17 p.m., but I left a brief professional message requesting an appointment at her earliest convenience. Next, I texted my assistant, Lynn. "Need to reschedule tomorrow's meetings. Personal emergency. Please connect with Harrington team to postpone until Thursday. Lynn's response came almost immediately. Consider it handled. Everything okay? The simple question pierced through my carefully maintained composure. Was anything okay? My marriage had imploded. My home had been invaded. My professional focus was shattered on the eve of a critical client presentation. By any reasonable standard, nothing was remotely okay. Yet beneath the shock and humiliation, I identified another unexpected emotion: relief. As if a persistent, low-grade fever had finally broken, leaving clarity in its wake. The constant accommodations and rationalizations that had become the background radiation of my marriage had suddenly ceased, allowing me to recognize their cumulative drain on my energy and self-perception. Unexpected situation at home, I texted back. We'll explain later. Thanks for handling the rescheduling. Standing, I moved through the house with newfound attentiveness, seeing it not as the marital home it had been hours ago, but as my space exclusively. The furnishings I had selected, the art I had purchased, the organization systems I had implemented. Richard's presence had always been secondary, his contributions limited to occasional opinions about decisions I ultimately made and financed. In the guest room that had apparently become Alexis's part-time residence, I stripped the bed linens with methodical precision, depositing them directly into the washing machine with the hottest water setting. The act was both practical sanitation and symbolic cleansing, reclaiming space that had been contaminated by betrayal. Our wedding photo still stood on the mantel, Richard and I beaming against a backdrop of autumn foliage, my law school friends, and his sales team colleagues mingling awkwardly at the edges of the frame. I remembered the photographer's comment about how photogenic Richard was, how naturally he took direction while I remained stiffly self-conscious despite his coaching. That observation had seemed innocuous at the time, even flattering to Richard. Now it struck me as prophetic. Richard had always been performing for an audience, adjusting his presentation based on what would generate the most favorable response. His authenticity extended precisely to the boundaries of his self-interest. I removed the photograph from its silver frame, placing the print in a folder labeled Personal Documentation in my home office. The empty frame I returned to the mantel, a placeholder for future memories I would create deliberately rather than through compromise and accommodation. Upstairs, I entered our bedroom with momentary hesitation, bracing against the intimate violation of knowing what had occurred there in my absence. The bedding would need to be replaced, not just cleaned. The mattress itself felt tainted beyond redemption. For tonight, I would sleep in the guest room after removing all traces of Alexis's occupation. In the master bathroom, I methodically collected Richard's remaining toiletries, expensive shaving cream I had gifted him last Christmas, hair products that cost more than my professional salon visits, the cologne I had once found appealing, but now smelled cloying and artificial. These I placed in a box for him to collect under supervised circumstances, unwilling to discard his possessions despite the temptation. Opening the medicine cabinet revealed prescription bottles with Richard's name, allergy medication, the anxiety, pills he occasionally took before major sales presentations, sleeping aids for his periodic insomnia. These I set aside separately, recognizing that despite my anger, withholding medication would cross an ethical boundary I wasn't willing to breach. As I worked, memories surfaced with painful clarity. Richard's growing resentment when I received my latest promotion, while his career remained stagnant. His subtle criticisms of my long hours and travel schedule, framed as concern for my well-being, but increasingly tinged with accusation. The gradual withdrawal of physical affection, attributed to stress, but now revealed as redirected attention. When had our paths diverged so dramatically? When had mutual support transformed into zero-sum competition? Perhaps it had always been. This way beneath the surface, my achievements somehow diminishing him in his own estimation, my financial success triggering insecurity rather than partnership pride. My phone buzzed again. More texts from Richard, their tone shifting from reasonable to indignant. "You've totally overreacted. Alexis's roommate won't let me stay there. All my things are at our house. You can't just decide it's only yours now. I'm coming back tomorrow to get what's mine. This isn't legal what you're doing." The last message triggered my professional instincts. Opening my laptop, I accessed the property records database through my firm's portal, confirming what I already knew. The deed listed Emily Chen as the sole owner, with no spousal claim documented. I took screenshots, then emailed them to my personal account with subject line, "Property Documentation," creating an easily accessible record. Next, I photographed Alexis's belongings I had discovered throughout the house, carefully documenting the evidence of their relationship and her residence in my home. These photos I saved in a secured folder labeled Divorce Proceedings, acknowledging for the first time that our separation would inevitably progress to legal dissolution. The methodical documentation process calmed my racing thoughts, providing a structured outlet for the chaotic emotions threatening to overwhelm my customary composure. This was familiar territory: gathering evidence, establishing timelines, building a case based on irrefutable facts rather than emotional allegations. I was reclaiming not just my house but my professional competence, applying it to personal crisis management. Around midnight, physical exhaustion finally overcame adrenaline. I had changed the locks, thankful for the 24-hour mobile locksmith service my neighbor had used last year, secured the property documentation, prepared a preliminary financial inventory, and created a to-do list for the coming days. I had transformed shock and betrayal into actionable steps forward. Not yet healing, but at least movement beyond paralysis. As I lay in the freshly made guest room bed, staring at the unfamiliar ceiling pattern from this different vantage point, I recognized that the weight of Richard's betrayal was matched by another realization. I had been carrying our life together, largely alone for longer than I had been willing to acknowledge. The shocking discovery of his infidelity was merely the visible eruption of a relationship that had been silently fracturing beneath the surface for years. Tomorrow would bring practical challenges: legal consultations, financial recalibrations, professional explanations for my sudden schedule changes. But for the first time since walking through my front door hours earlier, I felt something beyond anger and humiliation. I felt the first tentative stirrings of possibility, that what Richard had intended as devastating betrayal might ultimately become the catalyst for necessary liberation. The morning after discovering Richard's betrayal brought an unexpected gift: clarity. As sunlight streamed through the guest room blinds, I awoke with purpose rather than despair. Somewhere in the fitful hours of sleep, my subconscious had shifted from processing shock to formulating strategy. This wasn't merely about surviving betrayal, but reclaiming the personal power I had incrementally surrendered throughout our marriage. I reached for my phone, finding 17 missed calls from Richard and a string of increasingly agitated text messages. His final message, sent at 3:42 a.m., revealed the essential narcissism I had overlooked for years. "You're being completely irrational. I deserve better than this after everything I've done for you." Everything he had done for me. The phrase crystallized 3 years of subtle gaslighting and emotional manipulation. What exactly had Richard contributed to my life that hadn't ultimately served his interests? His occasional support during my career advancements had always carried an undercurrent of resentment. His domestic contributions diminished as my income increased. Even his affection had become transactional, warmth proportional to material benefits received. I silenced notifications from his number and opened my email to find Jessica Rothman had already responded to my voicemail. "In office from 7:30 a.m. Come by whenever. We'll make time. Bring financial documentation if possible." Preparing for this meeting activated professional instincts that had remained dormant in my personal life. I gathered tax returns, investment statements, property documents, and banking records with the same methodical precision I would for a complex corporate negotiation. The exercise revealed a disturbing pattern I had subconsciously avoided acknowledging. Richard's financial contributions had steadily decreased over 3 years, while his expenditures from our joint accounts had increased. The walk-in closet in our master bedroom told a similar story. My section contained practical professional attire with occasional quality pieces for important events. Richard's section overflowed with designer labels, custom suits, and shoes worth more than my monthly student loan payments. The disparity was so obvious, I wondered how I had normalized it for so long. In the second drawer of his nightstand, beneath subscription publications about luxury watches, I discovered bank statements from an account I didn't recognize. The most recent statement showed a balance of $43,267, significant funds hidden while Richard claimed he couldn't contribute to our household expenses due to commission restructuring. More disturbing than the financial deception was my own complicity in it. I had accepted increasingly transparent excuses because acknowledging the truth would require confronting the fundamental imbalance in our partnership. My professional training in identifying contractual discrepancies and negotiation inconsistencies had somehow never been applied to my marriage. This pattern extended beyond finances. I opened a long-neglected journal from my bottom desk drawer, finding entries from early in our relationship. Before Richard, I had maintained an active social circle, volunteered regularly with a legal aid organization, painted watercolors as stress relief, and trained for half marathons. Each of these personal passions had gradually disappeared, sacrificed to accommodate Richard's needs and manage an increasingly one-sided household. The watercolors struck a particular chord. I had once found genuine joy and restoration in creating abstract interpretations of emotional states, translating feelings into color and form when words seemed inadequate. Richard had subtly but persistently undermined this practice, questioning the time it required, suggesting more productive activities, eventually relegating my supplies to basement storage. Acting on impulse, I descended to the basement storage room, locating the art cabinet behind exercise equipment Richard had purchased and never used. Inside, my brushes remained in their protective case, paints sorted by color family, and specialized papers carefully preserved in acid-free containers. I had packed everything with the care of someone intending to return soon, not abandoning a vital form of self-expression. I carried the supplies to the sunroom, a space I had designed for painting but had gradually surrendered to Richard's preference for a second television viewing area. The room's eastern exposure provided perfect morning light, the kind that had once inspired my most satisfying creative sessions. Setting up a temporary easel, I selected colors intuitively: cerulean blue, cadmium red, burnt sienna, titanium white. Without preliminary sketching, I began applying color directly, allowing suppressed emotion to guide my hand rather than conscious composition. The physical sensation was immediately familiar: the slight resistance of brush against paper, the satisfying blend of pigments, the meditative focus that excluded all extraneous concerns. For 47 minutes, I existed solely within the creative process. No client demands, no marital betrayal, no strategic calculations, just color, movement, and emotional release. When I finally stepped back, the resulting image surprised me with its forceful energy, tumultuous dark swirls giving way to emerging light, chaotic elements resolving toward order at the composition's edge. The painting wasn't technically accomplished after years without practice, but it possessed authentic emotional resonance. It portrayed not just what had happened, but how I was choosing to respond, moving through turbulence toward emerging clarity. Most importantly, it reconnected me with a form of self-expression entirely independent of professional accomplishment or relational identity. Checking my watch, I realized my appointment with Jessica approached. I photographed the still wet painting, then carefully stored the supplies for later use. The brief creative session had functioned as unexpected emotional calibration, allowing me to approach the coming legal consultation from a centered place rather than reactive anger. Jessica Rothman's office reflected her personality, meticulously, organized, aesthetically minimalist, and instantly commanding respect. As one of the firm's most sought-after partners, she had earned her corner office with specialized expertise in high-asset divorces and a reputation for ruthless efficiency tempered by genuine compassion for clients. "Emily," she greeted me, dispensing with professional formality given our law school history. Her sharp eyes assessed my appearance, noting the composed exterior that likely contrasted with my internal state. "You look remarkably put together for someone whose marriage imploded yesterday." "Professional camouflage," I responded with the hint of a smile. "You taught me the importance of never revealing vulnerability during negotiations." "And this is certainly a negotiation," Jessica agreed, gesturing toward the conference area of her office, rather than maintaining the power dynamic of her desk. "Tell me everything relevant, starting with financials since you brought that impressive folder." For the next 40 minutes, I presented the situation with the same organized precision I would use for a complex corporate acquisition analysis. The property documentation, the hidden bank account, the systematic pattern of decreased contribution coupled with increased expenditure, the discovery of Richard and Alexis in my home, the evidence of her extended stays during my business travel. Jessica listened without interruption, occasionally noting details in her distinctive shorthand. When I finished, she reviewed her notes briefly before delivering her assessment. "Emily, I'm going to be direct because that's what you need right now. Legally, your position is exceptionally strong. The house is unambiguously your separate property. The hidden account demonstrates financial misconduct that will work in your favor during asset division. The infidelity, while emotionally significant, is actually less relevant legally than the financial deception." She paused, her expression softening slightly. "But there's something you're not addressing, how you allowed this situation to develop. As your friend and not just your attorney, I have to ask, when did you stop advocating for yourself in this marriage with the same vigor you bring to client advocacy?" The question landed with uncomfortable precision. When had I stopped applying my professional standards to my personal life? When had I accepted an increasingly unbalanced partnership as normal? "I think I conflated compromise with self-erasure," I admitted. "Somewhere along the line, I started believing that relationship success meant sacrificing my own needs rather than establishing genuine reciprocity." Jessica nodded. "That pattern appears in high-achieving women with remarkable consistency. We negotiate ferociously for clients or employers, but accept disadvantageous terms in our personal lives, often without recognizing the contradiction." Her assessment resonated with embarrassing accuracy. I had secured favorable terms for corporate clients and transactions worth hundreds of millions while simultaneously accepting my husband's transparent excuses for financial irresponsibility. "The good news," Jessica continued, "is that your professional capabilities are exactly what you need right now. The same strategic thinking, documentation discipline, and negotiation skills that make you an effective attorney will serve you perfectly through this divorce process." And the bad news? Richard won't go quietly. Men like him, who have benefited from significant financial support while maintaining a self-narrative of independence, typically react with disproportionate aggression when that support is threatened. Expect him to claim he sacrificed career opportunities for your advancement, contributed sweat equity to the home's value, or provided intangible support that justifies substantial compensation. He's already demanding access to the house to collect his things, I confirmed, though his definition of ownership seems fluid at best. "We'll address that immediately," Jessica assured me, turning to her computer. "I'm drafting temporary orders that formalize your exclusive right to the property and specify a supervised removal of his documented personal possessions. We'll also freeze the joint accounts pending equitable distribution determination." While Jessica prepared the necessary documentation, I considered the path forward. The practical aspects, legal proceedings, financial recalibration, property matters, felt manageable through methodical application of professional skills. The emotional dimension presented greater complexity, requiring resources I had neglected during my marriage. Jessica, beyond the legal strategy, what advice would you give me as someone who's witnessed similar situations? She considered the question carefully before responding. Reclaim what you surrendered, not just property or finances, but activities, friendships, and aspects of identity you compromised to accommodate a one-sided relationship. Your professional identity remained intact because it served Richard's interests. I suspect other dimensions of your authentic self weren't so fortunate. The watercolors immediately came to mind. The morning's brief creative session had reconnected me with a part of myself I had almost forgotten. What other aspects of my pre-Richard identity had been systematically suppressed under the guise of marital compromise? As Jessica completed the necessary filings, I mentally cataloged elements of myself that had gradually disappeared during my marriage. The half-marathon training, the legal aid volunteering, the regular dinners with female friends Richard found intimidating. The photography classes abandoned when they conflicted with his preference for weekend sporting events. One more thing, Jessica said, handing me the completed documents. While Richard was establishing his relationship with Alexis, what support system were you maintaining for yourself? The question highlighted another uncomfortable truth. I had allowed my support network to atrophy while focusing on professional advancement and marital accommodation. My closest friends had been gradually relegated to occasional lunch meetings and text exchanges. My parents, living on the opposite coast, received carefully edited updates that emphasized achievements while omitting growing concerns about my marriage. That's what I suspected, Jessica noted, reading my expression. Your immediate priority, beyond these legal proceedings, is reconstructing a personal support system. Professional strength without emotional reinforcement is ultimately unsustainable, especially through high-conflict divorce. As I left her office with a clear legal strategy initialized, Jessica's parting advice resonated more powerfully than the technical details of divorce proceedings. I had approached my marriage with fundamental imbalance, bringing professional excellence alongside personal compromise. Sustainable strength required integration rather than compartmentalization, applying the same standards of respect, reciprocity, and authenticity across all life dimensions. The forgotten strength I needed to reclaim wasn't just the ability to create boundaries or enforce consequences, though these were certainly part of the equation. The deeper strength lay in remembering that my value existed independently of relationships, achievements, or external validation, that the essence of who I was deserved expression and respect in every context, not just professional environments. Driving home, I made 3 commitments to myself. First, I would handle the divorce with the same strategic excellence I brought to corporate acquisitions. Second, I would systematically reclaim activities and connections I had surrendered during the marriage. And third, perhaps most importantly, I would never again accept relationships where I was required to make myself smaller to accommodate someone else's insecurity. 3 weeks after discovering Richard and Alexis in our home, I sat across from Martin Heller, CFO of Westridge Pharmaceuticals. The conference room on the 38th floor offered panoramic views of the city skyline, but neither of us was admiring the vista. We were deep in negotiations for what would become, if successful, the largest acquisition in my firm's history. Emily, these indemnification terms are simply unworkable, Martin stated, tapping the document between us. Our board won't accept unlimited liability exposure, even with the escrow provisions you've outlined. 1 month ago, I might have immediately offered a compromise to maintain relationship harmony, a professional habit that had spilled destructively into my personal life. Today, I remained silent, allowing the discomfort of the impasse to rest with Martin rather than rushing to resolve it. We could consider a liability cap at 3 times the purchase price, he finally suggested, filling the silence I had deliberately created. The selling shareholders would view that as insufficient protection given the regulatory landscape, I replied calmly. But I appreciate your willingness to move toward a middle ground. Perhaps we could structure a tiered approach with specific triggers for liability expansion beyond the base cap. Martin's expression shifted from frustration to interest. I'd need to see the specifics, but conceptually that might work. Can your team draft something for review tomorrow? We'll have it to you by noon, I confirmed, making a note in my portfolio. As the meeting adjourned, I received a text from my assistant. R at reception again. Security keeping him in lobby per protocol. Third attempt this week. I had anticipated Richard's escalating attempts to regain access to the house. What I hadn't expected was his decision to bring these efforts to my workplace, a miscalculation that revealed how fundamentally he had misunderstood both my professional boundaries and my growing resolve. Please tell security to remind him that all communication should go through our respective attorneys, then escort him from the building, I texted back. Document the incident for our records. Gathering my materials, I nodded farewell to the Westridge team and headed toward the private elevator. My phone buzzed with another message, this one from Jessica. Judge Parker granted our motion for exclusive use of the residence. Temporary support hearing set for next Friday. Richard's attorney requesting mediation before then. The development was expected, but nonetheless validating. The legal system had confirmed what property records already established. The house was unequivocally mine, regardless of Richard's claims of marital contribution. His request for mediation suggested growing awareness of his precarious position. In the 3 weeks since discovering his betrayal, I had methodically reconstructed both my daily routines and my longer-term vision. The guest room had become my temporary bedroom while I redecorated the master suite, removing all traces of Richard's presence and creating a space exclusively reflecting my preferences. The home office had been reorganized with ergonomic furnishings I had long desired, but Richard had deemed unnecessarily expensive. The basement storage room had been transformed into a functional art studio, where I now spent at least 30 minutes daily reconnecting with creative expression. These physical changes paralleled deeper recalibrations. I had reached out to former friends whose relationships had diminished during my marriage, scheduling regular dinner gatherings and weekend activities. I had resumed my legal aid volunteer work, providing pro bono consultation to women navigating housing insecurity. Most significantly, I had enrolled in a 10-week executive leadership program I had previously declined when Richard complained about the weekend commitments it would require. As the elevator descended, I considered the unacknowledged crossroads I now faced. The practical matters of divorce proceedings, asset division, and legal documentation were progressing with predictable efficiency. The more profound point involved my response to this disruption, whether to view it as devastating setback or transformative opportunity. Richard's perspective was clear from his increasingly desperate communications. His attorney's letters framed him as a supportive husband blindsided by an overreaction to a momentary indiscretion. His attempts to access the house focused on claiming material possessions rather than addressing the relationship breach. His workplace appearances aimed to pressure me through professional embarrassment when direct confrontation failed. These tactics revealed not just tactical miscalculation, but a fundamental misunderstanding of the woman he had married, or perhaps more accurately, the woman I had become despite the constraints of our marriage. The Emily who might have been intimidated by public confrontation or manipulated through guilt had been replaced by someone with clearer boundaries and stronger resolve. Exiting the elevator, I nodded to the security team who had managed Richard's latest appearance. Thank you for handling that situation discreetly. No problem, Ms. Chen, the lead officer replied. We've updated your security profile to restrict his access to all firm properties. The incident has been documented as requested. I appreciate your thoroughness, I said, signing the incident report he presented. The formal documentation? created another entry in the growing evidence file Jessica was assembling. Richard's pattern of escalating behavior would work against him in upcoming proceedings. Outside, my driver waited with the car door open. Another change implemented since the separation: professional car service for late workdays instead of rushing to catch the last express train. Richard had always criticized such expenditures as extravagant while thinking nothing of charging premium golf club memberships to our joint credit card. "Home, Ms. Chen?" the driver inquired. I checked my watch, 7:30 p.m. on a Thursday evening. Previously, this would have meant returning to an empty house, preparing a solitary meal, and working until midnight before falling asleep to the background noise of television. The routine had seemed necessary rather than chosen, a product of ambition rather than imbalance. "Actually, could you take me to Riverfront Park first? I'd like a short walk before heading home." The unscheduled detour represented another small reclamation: spontaneity without justification or accommodation. The park had been a favorite retreat during law school and early career years, its riverside paths offering both exercise and mental clarity. Like so many personal preferences, it had gradually disappeared from my routine as Richard's aversion to aimless walking reshaped our shared activities. As the car approached the park entrance, my phone rang with a restricted number, typically indicating a new client or sensitive professional matter. I answered with my standard professional greeting. "Emily, it's Alexis." The unexpected caller rendered me momentarily speechless. Since the confrontation in my foyer 3 weeks earlier, Alexis had remained peripheral to the unfolding legal proceedings, mentioned in documentation but not directly involved. "I'm sorry to call you directly," she continued into my silence, "but there are things you should know that your attorney might find relevant." "I'm listening," I replied neutrally, signaling the driver to remain parked while I took the call. Richard's been staying with me since that night, despite my roommate's objections. He promised it would be temporary while he sorted things out with you. But he's making no effort to find his own place, contributing nothing financially, and... She hesitated. "There are other women. At least 2 that I know of." The information was simultaneously unsurprising and valuable, confirmation of continuing patterns rather than isolated incidents. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked, maintaining professional detachment despite the personal nature of her revelations. "Because I made a mistake getting involved with a married man, but I'm not willing to be complicit in his ongoing manipulation," she replied with unexpected candor. "He's been telling people you had a mental breakdown, that you've frozen joint assets illegally, that you're vindictively keeping him from his possessions. And you don't believe that characterization." "I've seen the evidence myself," Alexis confirmed. "The property documents he claimed were just technical arrangements. The bank statements showing his hidden accounts, the credit card receipts. For gifts to multiple women, not just me. He's not the victim here, and I'm uncomfortable with how he's trying to portray you." "I appreciate this information," I said, maintaining professional boundaries despite the personal vindication her testimony provided. "My attorney may contact you for a formal statement if you're willing to provide one." "I am," she confirmed. "And Emily. I'm truly sorry for my role in this situation. I believed what I wanted to believe, but that doesn't excuse my actions." After ending the call, I forwarded a summary to Jessica, then requested 30 minutes before the driver continued to my home. The riverside path beckoned with evening tranquility, joggers completing after-work exercise, couples strolling with interlaced fingers, solitary individuals like myself seeking moments of reflection amid urban bustle. Walking along the familiar route, I considered the significance of Alexis's call. Beyond the practical legal advantages her testimony might provide, it represented something more meaningful: external validation that my experience of Richard wasn't distorted by emotion or misunderstanding. His patterns of deception and manipulation were sufficiently apparent that even someone who had participated in his betrayal could recognize their fundamental dishonesty. This confirmation accelerated my progression through the crossroads I now faced. The path backward, attempting reconciliation, accepting partial responsibility for his betrayal, negotiating compromised trust, revealed itself as fundamentally misaligned with both self-respect and future potential. The alternative direction, complete disentanglement, reclamation of suppressed identity elements, and reconstruction based on authentic values, offered challenge but also liberation. Reaching the riverside pavilion where I had often studied during law school, I paused to observe the water's constant movement, powerful, purposeful, and perpetually renewed. The metaphor wasn't subtle, but it resonated nonetheless. Like the river, I had continued moving forward despite obstacles, gathering strength from tributary experiences, occasionally diverted, but ultimately returning to essential nature. My phone buzzed with a message from Jessica, responding to my summary of Alexis's call. This changes the dynamic significantly. Her testimony undermines his victim narrative completely. We'll request a formal deposition before the temporary support hearing. The professional development was positive, but my thoughts had already moved beyond tactical legal advantages to more fundamental considerations. The crossroads I faced wasn't merely about navigating divorce proceedings effectively, though that remained important. The more significant decision involved my willingness to trust my own perceptions, establish healthier relationship patterns, and create a future based on authentic priorities rather than accommodated compromise. Returning to the waiting car, I directed the driver toward home with renewed clarity. The house that had briefly felt contaminated by betrayal had been reclaimed through intentional changes, not just removing Richard's possessions, but actively creating spaces aligned with my genuine preferences. Similarly, the life temporarily destabilized by his deception was being reconstructed with greater authenticity and intention. As we pulled into my driveway, I noticed landscapers had completed the front garden redesign I had commissioned the previous week, replacing Richard's preferred formal boxwoods with native flowering plants requiring less maintenance and providing greater seasonal variation. The symbolic significance wasn't lost on me, removing artificial constraints to allow more natural growth patterns. Inside, I moved through my evening routine with practiced efficiency, changing from professional attire to comfortable loungewear, preparing a simple but nutritious meal, reviewing documents for tomorrow's negotiations. The activities were similar to those of my married life, but the context had transformed completely. Each choice now reflected personal preference rather than relational compromise. Each moment contained potential for authentic expression rather than strategic accommodation. At precisely 9:30, my scheduled video call with the Executive Leadership Program cohort began. 15 accomplished professionals from diverse industries engaged in collaborative learning. The evening's discussion focused on authentic leadership during organizational crisis, a topic with obvious personal resonance given my current circumstances. Research consistently shows that leadership effectiveness during disruption correlates directly with authenticity, the facilitator explained. Not perfection or certainty, but genuine alignment between stated values and observable actions. This principle applied equally to personal transformation. The unacknowledged crossroads I faced wasn't really about which path to choose. The decision had been made the moment I refused to accept Richard's betrayal as somehow justified by my career success or travel schedule. The true challenge lay in maintaining consistent alignment between that initial boundary-setting moment and ongoing choices about identity reclamation and future vision. As the session concluded, participants were asked to identify one concrete action they would implement in their leadership practice before our next meeting. My commitment emerged with unexpected clarity. I will apply the same standards of integrity, respect, and authentic communication to my personal relationships that I maintain in professional contexts. No more compartmentalizing excellence or accepting compromised standards in any life domain. The statement represented both acknowledgement of past patterns and commitment to future integration. The crossroads I had been approaching since discovering Richard's betrayal wasn't fundamentally about him at all. It was about my willingness to advocate for myself with the same vigor I brought to client representation, to establish relationship standards aligned with my genuine values, and to create a life where professional achievement existed alongside rather than at the expense of personal fulfillment. 5 weeks after Richard's betrayal, I stood in my home office surrounded by documents spread across the large oak desk I had recently purchased to replace the glass-topped version Richard had insisted upon. The new desk was substantial, practical, and selected solely according to my preferences, symbolic of the decision-making autonomy I had reclaimed. The papers before me weren't legal briefs or corporate acquisition materials, but rather a comprehensive assessment of my current circumstances and resources, a personal due diligence exercise I had initiated to establish a clear foundation for moving forward. Jessica had suggested this methodical inventory during our most recent consultation. Before the temporary support hearing, you need absolute clarity on your complete financial position, she had advised. Not just the obvious, assets and liabilities, but everything from insurance policies to retirement projections to tax implications. Taking this recommendation further, I had expanded the inventory beyond finances to encompass all resources relevant to rebuilding: professional capabilities, social connections, personal interests, health considerations, and emotional resilience factors. The resulting documentation provided an unvarnished assessment of both strengths and vulnerabilities. The financial analysis was straightforward, revealing a position significantly stronger than I had initially assumed. Beyond the house, with its substantial equity and my established retirement accounts, there were stock options from my firm that would vest within 18 months, an inheritance from my maternal grandmother held in conservative investments, and the potential for partnership at Kelman & Associates within the next review cycle. Richard's financial claims against these assets appeared increasingly tenuous as Jessica's investigation progressed. His hidden account had been documented, along with systematic diversion of funds that should have contributed to household expenses. His insistence that he had sacrificed career opportunities for my advancement was undermined by employment records showing he had been terminated from 2 positions for performance issues, rather than voluntarily resigning to support my career. More illuminating than the financial documentation was the inventory of non-monetary resources I had conducted. The exercise revealed both surprising strengths and concerning gaps. My professional network was extensive and robust: colleagues who respected my work, clients who valued my expertise, mentors who had guided my career progression. When news of my separation had gradually circulated through professional channels, the support had been immediate and concrete. Senior partners adjusted my case assignments to accommodate legal proceedings without reducing my substantive responsibilities. Clients expressed concern without invasive questioning. Former classmates now in judicial positions provided insight into procedural aspects of divorce proceedings without ethical compromises. Conversely, my personal support network showed the effects of systematic neglect during my marriage. Close friendships had attenuated through reduced contact, family relationships maintained through perfunctory updates rather than genuine connection, and community involvement diminished to occasional financial contributions rather than active participation. This imbalance represented a significant vulnerability. Professional excellence without personal reinforcement created danger of one-dimensional identity, precisely the pattern that had contributed to accepting Richard's increasingly unbalanced relationship terms. Sustainable resilience required integration rather than compartmentalization, drawing strength from diverse connection sources rather than over-investing in a single life domain. The inventory of personal interests revealed similar patterns of neglect and opportunity. Beyond the rediscovered passion for painting, numerous abandoned activities awaited potential revival. The weekend hiking I had enjoyed before Richard complained about time away from his preferred social engagements, the culinary experimentation Displaced by his restricted food preferences, the literary discussion group abandoned when meeting times conflicted with his television viewing schedule. Most revealing was the health and wellness assessment. Years of prioritizing professional advancement while managing an increasingly unbalanced relationship had created measurable physical impacts: disrupted sleep patterns, elevated stress indicators, reduced cardiovascular fitness, and nutritional imbalances reflecting convenience rather than optimal functioning. This comprehensive inventory, financial, professional, social, personal, and physical, represented far more than divorce preparation. It constituted an honest reckoning with the cumulative consequences of subordinating authentic needs to relationship accommodation and professional achievement. The results were simultaneously sobering and empowering, clarifying exactly what required attention, while confirming substantial resources for rebuilding. My contemplation of these findings was interrupted by the security system notification. Someone was at the front door. The video feed showed a delivery courier with a large floral arrangement. While tempted to refuse delivery, assuming Richard had escalated to romantic gestures after legal maneuvering proved ineffective, professionalism prevailed. I accepted the arrangement with neutral courtesy. The accompanying card revealed unexpected origins. Congratulations on securing the Westridge acquisition. The board was impressed with your negotiation skills and integrity throughout the process. We look forward to our continued partnership. Martin Heller, CFO. The professional acknowledgement arrived at a particularly meaningful moment. The Westridge negotiations had progressed through the most challenging phase during precisely the same period as Richard's betrayal and its aftermath. Rather than allowing personal disruption to compromise professional performance, I had maintained exceptional standards throughout, perhaps even exceeding previous capabilities by bringing increased authenticity and boundary clarity to the negotiation process. Placing the arrangement on the dining room table, a location Richard would have vetoed as impractical, I returned to my inventory with reinforced purpose. The professional validation reflected an important truth. Crisis reveals character rather than creating it. The strengths now supporting my navigation through personal upheaval had always existed, but had been selectively suppressed in service to marital harmony. My phone rang with Jessica's distinctive tone. The temporary support hearing concluded, she announced without preamble. Judge Parker was unimpressed by Richard's claims of financial contribution to the household. The temporary order grants you exclusive use of the residence, denies his spousal support request, and requires him to account for funds withdrawn from joint accounts before they were frozen. The legal victory, while significant, felt almost anticlimactic compared to the internal clarity emerging from my comprehensive inventory process. External validation from legal authorities, while practically important, mattered less than my developing conviction about justified boundaries and authentic priorities. There's more, Jessica continued. Alexis provided sworn testimony about Richard's pattern of deception, not just regarding your marriage, but his representations about financial status, employment prospects, and intentions toward her. Her evidence was compelling enough that Judge Parker referenced it specifically in denying Richard's support claims. How did Richard react? I asked, curious about his response to this public unraveling of his carefully constructed narrative. Not, well, Jessica confirmed. He accused Alexis of vindictive lying, then suggested you had manipulated her testimony through financial incentives. Judge Parker cleared the courtroom briefly to address his behavior. Richard's attorney appeared visibly distressed by his client's presentation. The description aligned with patterns emerging from my inventory analysis. Richard's response to challenged entitlement had always been escalating accusations rather than authentic accountability. The behavior that had manifested in our private interactions was now being displayed in professional legal contexts, confirming my experience rather than contradicting it. What happens next? I asked, mentally incorporating this development into my strategic planning. Richard's attorney has requested a settlement conference, suggesting their position has weakened considerably. I recommend proceeding while maintaining our documentation efforts. Experience suggests men like Richard often alternate between aggressive opposition and sudden capitulation when their preferred narratives prove ineffective. After concluding the call, I added notes to my inventory documentation. The legal developments provided external validation of assessments I had already reached independently. Richard's claims lacked substance, his presentation lacked credibility, and his strategy lacked coherence. The objective confirmation strengthened my resolve to maintain boundaries while proceeding with personal reconstruction. Returning to the inventory process, I focused on perhaps its most important element, the assessment of future vision and priorities. This forward-looking analysis required the same rigorous honesty as the evaluation of current resources, identifying genuine aspirations rather than reactive goals or externally imposed expectations. The professional domain offered relatively straightforward projection. Partnership at Kelman & Associates remained a valid objective aligned with both capability and contribution. However, the inventory process had clarified that partnership would constitute a component of fulfillment rather than its primary foundation, a significant recalibration from previous assumptions. Personal relationship considerations presented greater complexity. The inventory had revealed not just Richard's specific betrayals, but patterns in my own partner selection and relationship maintenance that required addressing before future connections could develop healthily. The questionnaire I had completed with clinical detachment documented relationship behaviors worth maintaining: clear communication, financial transparency, sexual compatibility, alongside patterns requiring modification, particularly tendency toward excessive accommodation and conflict avoidance. Living environment analysis generated unexpected insights. While the current house represented a significant asset and hard-won victory in divorce proceedings, the honest inventory questioned whether it truly aligned with authentic preferences or merely symbolized relationship achievement. The suburban location, significant square footage and maintenance requirements had been selected according to conventional success markers rather than genuine lifestyle priorities. The property's meaning had shifted from symbol of marital accomplishment to representation of reclaimed independence, but its fundamental alignment with my authentic preferences remained questionable. Community and contribution considerations revealed perhaps the most significant gaps between current circumstances and authentic aspirations. The honest inventory documented minimal community engagement beyond professional affiliations, a stark contrast to pre-Richard involvement with legal aid services, mentorship programs, and arts organizations. This domain represented not just past loss but future opportunity, potential sources of meaning beyond professional achievement and personal relationship. Physical well-being assessment generated concrete action items rather than philosophical reconsideration. The documented decline in fitness, sleep quality, and nutritional balance had clear remediation paths, returning to regular exercise, establishing consistent sleep routines, and prioritizing nutrient-dense meal preparation over convenience options. These practical adjustments would support all other rebuilding efforts by enhancing energy, cognitive function, and emotional regulation. The comprehensive inventory, now nearing completion after 3 days of methodical assessment, represented far more than divorce preparation or damage evaluation. It constituted the essential foundation for authentic reconstruction, identifying exactly what resources were available, what patterns required modification, and what aspirations deserved prioritization in the emerging future. Closing the leather portfolio containing these comprehensive assessments, I experienced a moment of unexpected clarity. The betrayal that had initially appeared devastating had ultimately initiated necessary recalibration. Without Richard's profound breach of trust, I might have continued indefinitely in patterns of excessive accommodation and selective self-suppression, achieving professional success while accepting personal diminishment. The honest inventory had transformed understanding of both past and future. What initially appeared as catastrophic relationship failure now revealed itself as necessary course correction, painful but ultimately aligned with authentic development. The comprehensive assessment had identified not just what had been lost through betrayal, but what had been gradually surrendered through compromised standards and deferred authenticity. Most significantly, the inventory process had clarified that moving forward required more than reactive response to betrayal or technical management of divorce proceedings. Authentic reconstruction demanded proactive vision informed by genuine priorities rather than externally imposed expectations or relationship-based compromises. The assessment had identified precise resources available for this reconstruction: financial assets, professional capabilities, nascent social connections, rediscovered personal interests, and emerging self-knowledge. With this foundation established, I was prepared not just to navigate divorce proceedings effectively, but to create a future based on integrated authenticity rather than compartmentalized achievement or relationship accommodation. The honest inventory had transformed crisis response into intentional reconstruction, replacing reaction with creation, victimhood with agency, and loss with possibility. 2 months after discovering Richard's betrayal, I hosted a dinner party, the first social gathering in my home since the separation began. The evening wasn't a calculated attempt to project recovery or manufactured normalcy. Rather, it represented the natural culmination of deliberately reconstructed connections and reclaimed personal space. The dining table that had previously hosted Richard's business associates now accommodated 8 women who represented different chapters of my life journey. Mira and Stephanie from law school, whose friendship had dimmed but never disappeared during my marriage. Daniela and Wei from my early career at Kelman, who had risen alongside me through the firm's competitive ranks. Teresa and Priya from my volunteer work with legal aid services, recently resumed after a 3-year hiatus. And most significantly, my younger sister Audrey and my mother Carol, visiting from the West Coast for the first time since the separation. "I'm still not entirely clear on how you discovered his affair," Mira commented as I served the main course. A Malaysian curry recipe my mother had taught me in college that Richard had always deemed too aromatic for our home. The official story seems sanitized for legal purposes. The directness was characteristic of Mira, whose prosecutorial career had eliminated any tendency toward conversational subterfuge. While others might have considered the question insensitive, I appreciated the opportunity to reclaim my narrative through honest retelling rather than carefully edited summaries. I returned from a business trip early and found him with Alexis. "In our bedroom," I explained, the facts no longer carrying the emotional devastation of that initial moment. She was wearing my anniversary robe, the silk kimono I bought myself when Richard forgot our second anniversary. The confrontation that followed revealed not just the affair, but systematic financial deception and identity manipulation. "And you immediately threw them both out?" Stephanie asked, her expression reflecting appropriate outrage on my behalf. "After confirming the house was solely in my name," I confirmed. A technical detail that proved rather consequential. "My favorite detail in this entire saga," Audrey interjected with characteristic sisterly vindication. "The man spent 3 years acting like lord of the manor without ever bothering to read the property documents. Entitlement creates remarkable blind spots," Daniela observed. As the firm's most experienced divorce attorney before transitioning to corporate law, her assessment carried particular weight. I've seen countless cases where financial manipulators failed to recognize the legal vulnerabilities in their own arrangements. My mother, who had remained thoughtfully silent through this exchange, finally spoke. "What matters isn't just that you reclaimed your property, Emily. It's that you've reclaimed yourself in the process." Her observation captured the essential truth of the past 2 months. The legal victories and property retention represented external validation, but the more significant transformation had occurred internally. The systematic reclamation of personal authority, authentic expression, and relational reciprocity. The conversation flowed organically through dinner, each woman sharing perspectives that illuminated different aspects of my unfolding situation. Priya offered insights from her psychology background about relationship patterns that create vulnerability to manipulation. Teresa shared practical advice about financial restructuring based on her work with clients navigating economic disruption. Wei and Daniela provided professional counsel regarding the partnership track at Kelman amid personal upheaval. Most valuably, these women created space for both strength and vulnerability, acknowledging the professional competence that had never faltered while validating the emotional impact of profound betrayal. Unlike Richard, who had required my continuous accommodation of his insecurities, these connections allowed authentic expression of complex experiences without demanding emotional management or narrative simplification. As the evening progressed to coffee and dessert in the living room, a space previously dominated by Richard's oversized recliner, now replaced with conversation-oriented seating, Audrey raised the question I had been contemplating since completing my resource inventory. "Have you thought about whether you'll stay in this house long-term?" she asked. "It's beautiful, but it seems designed around a life you were building with Richard rather than what you might choose for yourself now." The question reflected Audrey's characteristic perceptiveness. Despite our 5-year age difference and divergent career paths, her work as an environmental scientist contrasting with my corporate legal focus, she often identified considerations I had only partially articulated to myself. "I've been questioning that myself," I admitted. The house represented success within a particular narrative: suburban achievement, conventional status markers, space for potential family expansion. It served its purpose during the divorce proceedings by establishing clear ownership and boundaries. But I'm not convinced it aligns with my authentic preferences moving forward. "What would align with those preferences?" my mother asked, her question containing no judgment or expectation, unlike earlier years when she had subtly pressed for traditional life milestones. "I've been considering a loft in the Arts District," I revealed, sharing thoughts previously explored only in private reflection. Walking distance to both the office and cultural venues, less square footage, but more intentional space, closer to the volunteer legal clinic where I've resumed advisory work. The vision had developed gradually through my inventory process, recognition that the suburban location had always represented compromise rather than preference, that my natural inclination favored urban energy over manufactured tranquility, that property maintenance consumed time better allocated to meaningful activities. "The suburban fortress never suited you," Audrey affirmed. "I remember visiting after you first moved in. You seemed like you were playing house rather than creating a home. This was Richard's vision, not yours." I restricted myself to influencing design details rather than questioning the fundamental premise, I acknowledged. Classic lawyer behavior, negotiating terms within an established framework without challenging the framework itself. "When might you make this transition?" Teresa inquired, her practical nature focusing on implementation rather than concept. "The divorce settlement conference is scheduled for next month," I explained. Based on Richard's attorney's recent communications, they're preparing for resolution rather than continued litigation. Once the legal matters conclude, I'll have clear parameters for financial restructuring, including housing transitions. "You should consider this neighborhood," Wei suggested, pulling up a property listing on her phone. The converted warehouse. She displayed featured exposed brick walls, industrial windows, and open concept design perfectly suited for both living and creative pursuits. 3 blocks from your volunteer clinic, walking distance to the office, and there's a dedicated art studio space. The suggestion wasn't merely practical housing advice, but recognition of my rekindled creative practice, a dimension of identity I had begun sharing with my reconstructed social circle. Wei had noticed the watercolor materials in my home office, and the recent paintings displayed in the sunroom, connecting these expressions with future living considerations without requiring explanation or justification. This simple moment of being truly seen, having preferences acknowledged without requiring elaborate defense or explanation, highlighted the profound difference between my current social connections and the relationship with Richard, where he had demanded justification for personal interests that didn't directly benefit him. These women naturally supported authentic expression without requiring purpose validation or outcome measurement. The neighborhood association also runs a mentorship program with the downtown high school's pre-law program, Priya added. They're always seeking attorneys willing to provide guidance to first-generation college applicants interested in legal careers. This observation connected housing considerations with emerging community engagement priorities, another dimension identified in my comprehensive inventory as requiring development. The layered alignment between practical housing options and deeper purpose considerations reflected the integrated approach I was cultivating to replace previous compartmentalization. As the evening continued, conversation shifted naturally between practical considerations, professional developments, family updates, and philosophical reflections. Unlike social gatherings during my marriage, where Richard's need for attention had dictated conversational flow and topic selection, this exchange moved organically according to collective interests rather than individual dominance. When my guests departed shortly before midnight, the farewell exchanges included concrete plans rather than vague intentions, scheduled lunch meetings, confirmed gallery visits, planned volunteer collaborations, and definite dates for my mother and Audrey's next visit. These weren't perfunctory social commitments, but genuine connection continuations, each representing a strand in the supporting network I was deliberately reconstructing. Alone in the house that now truly functioned as my space rather than a contested territory, I reflected on the evening's significance. The gathering represented far more than social entertainment or performative recovery. It constituted tangible implementation of priorities identified through my inventory process, the cultivation of reciprocal relationships, the integration of personal and professional dimensions, the creation of space for authentic expression and meaningful exchange. More significantly, the evening demonstrated the transition from crisis response to intentional creation. 2 months earlier, focused on legal maneuvers and emotional stabilization, I could not have hosted such a gathering. The progression from acute betrayal management to deliberate community cultivation represented genuine healing, not through time passage alone, but through specific reconstruction efforts aligned with authentic values. My phone chimed with a message from Audrey. "Proud of you, sis. Not just for surviving his betrayal, but for creating something better than what you had before. The Emily I saw tonight is more authentically you than I've seen in years. Also, that curry was magnificent. Mom's already plotting to help you look at Loft's next visit." The sisterly validation brought unexpected emotion. Recognition that those who had known me longest could perceive the authenticity emerging through this challenging transition. What might appear to casual observers as relationship failure was being recognized by those with deeper perspective as necessary realignment with essential nature and genuine priorities. The supporting circle assembled this evening differed fundamentally from conventional support systems designed primarily for crisis management or emotional stabilization. While these women had certainly provided those functions during acute phases of the separation, their current role transcended mere comfort provision. They were active participants in reconstruction rather than passive witnesses to recovery, contributing perspectives, challenging assumptions, validating directions, and reinforcing boundaries. Perhaps most significantly, these relationships operated with fundamental reciprocity that had been absent in my marriage. Unlike Richard, whose insecurities required constant management, and whose needs perpetually superseded mine, these connections allowed mutual exchange of support, insight, and validation. I could simultaneously receive guidance regarding divorce proceedings while offering professional mentorship to younger colleagues, process emotional experiences while supporting others through their challenges, accept practical assistance while providing valuable perspective on others' situations. This balanced reciprocity represented healing at the relationship system level, rather than merely the individual recovery dimension. Beyond addressing the specific betrayal wounds inflicted by Richard, these connections were reconstructing my fundamental understanding of relationship dynamics, replacing asymmetrical accommodation with mutual respect, compartmentalized functioning, with integrated authenticity, and performance requirements with genuine expression. As I prepared for sleep in the guest room that had become my temporary bedroom pending master suite renovation, I recognized that the evening had established an important milestone in the transformation journey. The gathering had demonstrated that betrayal, while painful, had ultimately initiated necessary recalibration, breaking patterns of asymmetrical relationship accommodation while creating space for connections aligned with authentic values and reciprocal exchange. The supporting circle now actively developing around me would provide not just emotional reinforcement during remaining divorce proceedings, but also essential perspective for future decisions about living environment, professional direction, creative expression, and relationship patterns. Unlike the isolated paradigm I had accepted during marriage, where Richard functioned as primary reference point for most decisions, this diverse network offered multifaceted wisdom for navigating complex life dimensions. Most importantly, these connections reinforced fundamental boundaries that would prevent future repetition of unhealthy relationship patterns. The women who had gathered this evening recognized and celebrated my strength, competence, and discernment, without requiring diminishment to accommodate insecurity. They modeled reciprocal exchange where vulnerability coexisted with capability rather than undermining it. They demonstrated that authentic support enhances rather than constrains individual expression. The dinner party that had begun as simple, social gathering had ultimately affirmed the essential truth emerging through my transformation process. That rebuilding after betrayal involved not just individual recovery, but systematic recalibration of relationship patterns, environmental arrangements, and fundamental priorities, creating foundations for sustainable thriving rather than merely repairing damage from past dysfunction. 3 months after Richard's betrayal, I faced my first significant professional setback since the separation began. The Harrison acquisition, a deal I had structured meticulously over 6 months, collapsed unexpectedly when the target company received a competing offer significantly above our valuation thresholds. The managing partner called me to his office to discuss the situation, his expression betraying concern not about the failed deal, but about my potential reaction to it. "Emily, I want to be clear that no one views this outcome as a reflection on your performance," he began, his carefully measured tone suggesting he expected emotional fragility from me. The competing offer came in 38% above market valuation. No reasonable firm would match those terms. This isn't connected to your personal situation. His assumption that I would conflate professional outcomes with personal circumstances revealed how Richard's narrative had subtly permeated my workplace despite my consistent performance. The suggestion that I might attribute standard business developments to emotional instability indicated that colleagues were viewing me through a lens distorted by divorce stereotypes rather than my demonstrated capabilities. "I appreciate your concern, Victor," I replied with professional composure. "But I understand market dynamics perfectly well. Greenfield's offer represents irrational exuberance rather than sound valuation. Our analysis was correct, and our client is better served by walking away than overpaying." His visible relief at my composed response was simultaneously validating and frustrating. Confirmation that I was exceeding inappropriate expectations rather than being assessed by established professional standards. This interaction revealed the first significant external resistance pattern emerging since Richard's departure: the subtle diminishing of professional credibility based on personal circumstances rather than demonstrated performance. As I returned to my office, I recognized this moment as an important test, not of my professional capabilities, which had never faltered, but of my response to others' perception shifts based on knowledge of my divorce. The old pattern would have involved overperformance to disprove unstated assumptions, working additional hours to demonstrate emotional stability through excessive productivity, essentially accepting the burden of disproving negative presumptions. Instead, I chose a different approach. I scheduled a meeting with Victor for the following morning, prepared a comprehensive analysis of the failed acquisition identifying specific factors beyond our control, and structured recommendations for refining valuation approaches in future comparable situations. Rather than attempting to prove emotional stability through overwork, I would address the underlying assumptions directly through exceptional analytical clarity. This deliberate response to external resistance represented significant growth beyond reaction patterns that had characterized my marriage to Richard. Where I had previously accepted responsibility for managing others' perceptions regardless of their accuracy, I was now establishing boundaries around appropriate expectations while maintaining professional excellence on my own terms. The resistance emerging in my professional environment proved mild compared to the patterns developing in my personal interactions with Richard. As the divorce proceedings progressed toward final resolution, his approach alternated between aggressive demands and manipulative appeals, each representing different manifestations of entitlement challenged by consequences. Your client's position regarding spousal support remains unreasonable, his attorney's latest communication to Jessica stated. Mr. Denton made significant career sacrifices to support Ms. Chen's professional advancement, including relocating twice for her job opportunities. These contributions entitle him to ongoing financial support, reflecting the lifestyle established during marriage. The revisionist history would have been laughable if it weren't so strategically calculated. Richard's relocations had occurred after being terminated from previous positions, with my career providing convenient cover for professional failures. His sacrifices had consisted primarily of spending my income while presenting himself as the household provider. The lifestyle he sought to maintain had been financed almost exclusively through my earnings, while he diverted his irregular income to personal indulgences and hidden accounts. Jessica's response had been characteristically precise. Financial. Discovery has thoroughly documented that Mr. Denton's career transitions were consequences of performance issues rather than voluntary sacrifices. Furthermore, bank records establish that his contributions to household expenses decreased by 78% during the final 18 months of marriage, while his personal expenditures increased by 42%. These documented patterns do not support claims of either sacrifice or contribution. When legal maneuvering proved ineffective, Richard shifted to direct emotional appeals. Texts, emails, and even handwritten letters delivered to my office expressing remorse, requesting understanding, and suggesting reconciliation possibilities. These communications revealed another resistance pattern: the assumption that emotional manipulation could overcome factual realities, that sufficient performance of contrition might erase documented deception. Emily, I know I made terrible mistakes, one such message read, but 3 years of marriage deserve more than clinical legal dissolution. We built a life together that meant something. Can we meet just once without attorneys to remember what connected us before making irreversible decisions? The appeal contained subtle manipulation techniques I might have missed earlier in our relationship. The implication that legal proceedings were somehow less legitimate than emotional considerations. The suggestion that remembering connection should supersede addressing betrayal. The positioning of divorce as my unilateral decision rather than the natural consequence of his actions. My response to these manipulative approaches had evolved significantly from earlier patterns. Where I might previously have engaged with emotional appeals out of conflict avoidance or reconciliation hope, I now maintained consistent boundaries. All communication should continue through our respective attorneys. The proceedings are progressing appropriately toward resolution. Perhaps the most challenging resistance pattern emerged through mutual acquaintances and former friends who had maintained connections with Richard. These interactions revealed how effectively he had constructed an alternative narrative about our separation, positioning himself as the remorseful husband whose momentary indiscretion had been met with disproportionate reaction from a career-obsessed wife. "Richard seems genuinely devastated about how everything unfolded," commented Thomas Graham, a former colleague, during an industry reception. "He mentioned you won't even consider counseling options before finalizing the divorce. That seems uncharacteristically rigid given your usual thoughtful approach." The interaction illustrated Richard's strategic narrative deployment, providing partial information that portrayed him as accountable while simultaneously characterizing my boundaries as unreasonable. The technique was particularly effective, with peripheral acquaintances who lacked complete context for assessing his representations. "Thomas, I appreciate your concern," I responded with professional composure. "But Richard's private communications differ substantially from his public narrative. I'm making decisions based on comprehensive information rather than selective disclosures. I hope you'll understand that divorce proceedings involve complexities beyond what either party might share in social contexts." This measured response represented significant growth beyond my previous conflict avoidance patterns. Rather than accepting responsibility for correcting Richard's misrepresentations or providing justifications for my decisions, I established appropriate information boundaries while neither confirming nor contradicting his narrative. The approach acknowledged the manipulation attempt without becoming entangled in its dynamics. As these various resistance patterns emerged across professional, legal, and social domains, I recognized them as inevitable aspects of authentic transformation rather than obstacles to it. Each represented an opportunity to practice new response, patterns aligned with reclaimed personal authority rather than defaulting to previous accommodation habits. The most significant resistance, however, emerged not from external sources, but from internal patterns, the conditioned responses and automatic thoughts that had developed during 3 years of progressive accommodation to Richard's needs and narratives. These internal resistance elements manifested in surprising moments of self-doubt, instinctive self-blame, and automatic consideration of his perspective even when objectively unjustified. While reviewing property division proposals, I caught myself wondering whether my position was excessively punitive despite its obvious legal justification. When declining a social invitation conflicting with court proceedings, I experienced disproportionate guilt about potential disappointment I might cause. During partnership consideration discussions at the firm, momentary imposter feelings emerged, despite consistent performance excellence. These internal resistance patterns represented the most subtle and persistent aspects of Richard's influence. The internalized doubts and reflexive accommodations that had become neural pathways through repetitive relationship dynamics. Unlike external resistance that could be addressed through clear boundaries and consistent responses, these internal patterns required conscious recognition and deliberate recalibration through sustained awareness practices. My approach to these internal resistance elements drew on both professional discipline and rediscovered creative practices. When automatic self-doubt emerged, I documented the specific thought, identified its relationship to previous patterns, and consciously reframed it according to objective reality rather than conditioned perception. When reflexive guilt arose about establishing boundaries, I created small watercolor representations of the emotional experience, externally processing the sensation without being governed by it. Most effectively, I developed a daily journaling practice, specifically addressing the gap between conditioned responses and conscious values, documenting instances where automatic thoughts contradicted examined priorities, where emotional reactions reflected past patterns rather than present realities, where decision hesitation emerged from internalized narratives rather than authentic consideration. This systematic approach to internal resistance patterns yielded gradual but significant results. The frequency of automatic self-doubt decreased with consistent recognition and reframing. The intensity of reflexive guilt diminished through creative processing and conscious contextualization. The hesitation in boundary establishment reduced through repeated experiences of positive outcomes following appropriate limit setting. Perhaps most importantly, addressing these internal resistance patterns reinforced the fundamental understanding that emerged through my transformation journey: that sustainable change requires integration of cognitive recognition, emotional processing, behavioral modification, and environmental restructuring. The intellectual understanding of relationship dynamics that informed legal proceedings was necessary but insufficient without corresponding emotional processing that watercolor practice facilitated. The boundary-setting behaviors essential for managing Richard's continued manipulation attempts required environmental support from reconstructed social connections. 6 weeks before the final divorce hearing, these various resistance patterns, professional, legal, social, and internal, culminated in what Jessica described as the predictable last-ditch effort from Richard's legal team. His attorney requested an emergency settlement conference, suggesting newly discovered evidence might significantly impact proceedings if agreement couldn't be reached before formal court presentation. This is textbook behavior when previous approaches have failed, Jessica explained during our preparation meeting. The evidence is almost certainly either irrelevant or non-existent, a desperation tactic designed to create anxiety and pressure settlement on unfavorable terms. The question isn't whether to attend the conference, but how to approach it strategically. The situation represented a perfect crystallization of resistance patterns requiring integrated response. The professional dimension required thorough preparation regardless of the likely tactical nature of the request. The legal aspect demanded maintaining established positions while remaining appropriately responsive to legitimate considerations. The social element involved managing internal responses to inevitable misrepresentations. The psychological component required maintaining emotional equilibrium during deliberate destabilization attempts. As Jessica and I developed our conference approach, I recognized that my response to this culminating resistance effort would demonstrate the extent of transformation achieved during the preceding months. The outcome would reveal whether I had truly developed new response patterns or merely managed temporary adjustments to acute circumstances. The resistance patterns I had encountered since Richard's betrayal, both external manipulations and internal conditioned responses, had ultimately strengthened rather than weakened my transformation process. Each challenge had provided specific opportunities to practice new response patterns, reinforce reclaimed boundaries, and integrate authentic priorities across life dimensions. What had initially appeared as obstacles to recovery had become catalysts for deeper integration and more sustainable change. 4 months after discovering Richard's betrayal, I stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows of a downtown loft, evaluating the space not just as potential property acquisition, but as physical manifestation of my evolving approach to life after betrayal. The industrial-style unit occupied the entire 6th floor of a converted textile factory, its open concept design and exposed structural elements representing radical departure from the compartmentalized suburban home Richard and I had shared. "The owner accepted your offer this morning," said Nina Castillo, the real estate agent who had guided my property search with refreshing directness. "The inspection is scheduled for Thursday, and assuming no significant issues, we could close within 30 days. Are you certain about selling the house before finalizing this purchase? You could technically maintain both properties until you're completely ready to transition." The question reflected conventional risk management, maintaining secure possession of existing assets until replacement acquisition was guaranteed. This approach would have aligned perfectly with my previous decision-making framework, where calculated certainty took precedence over exploratory possibility, where potential downside consistently outweighed speculative upside. "I'm proceeding with the house sale regardless of this purchase outcome," I confirmed, my response reflecting the experimental mindset I had been deliberately cultivating. "If this property doesn't work out for any reason, I'll find temporary accommodations until identifying the right space." The suburban house represents a life chapter that's concluded. Continuing to inhabit it while pursuing new directions creates unnecessary transition friction. Nina nodded, her expression indicating both respect for my clarity and subtle surprise at my comfort with potential temporary displacement. That's uncommonly decisive. Most clients in post-divorce transitions prioritize stability even when the property doesn't align with their preferences. I've discovered that premature certainty often creates more significant long-term costs than temporary uncertainty, I replied, articulating a principle that had emerged through my transformation process. Physical displacement seems less disruptive than psychological misalignment at this point. This perspective represented profound evolution from my approach during marriage and early legal proceedings, where certainty and control had functioned as primary decision criteria. The experimental mindset now informing my choices valued alignment and authenticity above premature resolution, exploratory possibility above artificial certainty, and learning process above perfect outcomes. This shift had developed gradually, through deliberate practice rather than intellectual revelation. Following Jessica's guidance during early divorce proceedings, I had begun implementing small decision experiments in low-stakes contexts, trying new restaurants without researching reviews, attending cultural events outside familiar preferences, engaging conversation partners with differing perspectives, testing varied work approaches without guaranteed outcomes. These purposeful experiments created cumulative evidence that exploratory approaches often generated unexpected benefits alongside manageable downsides. The Thai restaurant selected spontaneously introduced culinary experiences I would have missed through advanced research filtering. The experimental theater performance I would have rejected based on descriptions provided unique creative inspiration. The conversational detours with diverse colleagues yielded unexpected professional insights and collaborations. As these small experiments accumulated positive outcomes, I gradually expanded the approach to higher-stakes decisions, volunteering for a complex case outside my specialized expertise, restructuring my workspace against conventional efficiency models, establishing communication boundaries with Richard that prioritized clarity over conflict avoidance, and now, selling the suburban house before securing replacement housing. The evolving experimental mindset manifested most visibly in my creative practice, which had expanded beyond occasional watercolor sessions to include mixed media exploration, photographic composition, and collaborative art projects through a community studio I had joined. Unlike my previous approach to creative activities, focused on technical proficiency and measurable improvement, my current practice embraced process exploration, unexpected outcomes, and learning through productive failure. "Do you want to measure the north wall before we leave?" Nina asked, gesturing toward the exposed brick expanse I had been contemplating. "You mentioned potentially displaying artwork there." "No measurements necessary," I replied, the response itself representing my shifting approach. "I'll adapt the display to the space rather than requiring precise pre-planning. The wall's imperfections and irregularities will inform the arrangement, rather than constraining it." As we prepared to leave the loft, my phone vibrated with a notification from Jessica. Settlement conference scheduled for tomorrow at 10 a.m. Richard's attorney still refusing to specify alleged new evidence. Standard intimidation tactic. Recommend proceeding as planned with full documentation preparation. The timing seemed appropriate, addressing the culmination of legal proceedings while simultaneously advancing future living arrangements. The parallel processes represented the integrated approach I had been developing, where ending previous patterns and creating new possibilities occurred simultaneously rather than sequentially. During the drive back to my office, I considered how the experimental mindset now informing my decisions would apply to tomorrow's settlement conference. Previous high-stakes negotiations had involved extensive scenario planning, anticipated response mapping, and predetermined outcome thresholds. While thorough preparation remained essential, my approach now incorporated greater adaptability, reduced attachment to specific outcomes, and openness to unexpected developments. Upon returning to my office, I found an unmarked envelope that had been hand-delivered during my absence. Inside was a single photograph. Richard and me at a charity gala 3 years earlier, his arm possessively around my waist, both of us smiling with practiced public composure. No accompanying note explained its purpose, but the implicit message was clear: attempted emotional destabilization before tomorrow's legal proceedings. 6 months earlier, this calculated manipulation would have triggered significant distress. Memories of better times, doubts about divorce decisions, guilt about relationship dissolution. Today, I studied the photograph with analytical detachment, noting the visible tension in my posture, the performance quality of my smile, and the subtle power dynamic conveyed through Richard's positioning. Rather than triggering nostalgic doubt, the image provided confirmation of patterns I had since identified and addressed. Instead of discarding the photograph or allowing it to create emotional disruption, I placed it in my settlement conference folder. The attempted manipulation would become evidence informing our approach rather than achieving its intended destabilization. This response demonstrated another dimension of the experimental mindset, transforming potential obstacles into informational resources, converting attempted disruption into strategic advantage. My preparation for the settlement conference reflected this integrated approach. Beyond the standard documentation Jessica and I had compiled, financial records, property valuations, expenditure analyses, settlement projections, I added materials reflecting psychological preparation. The journal documenting my transition from shock to strategic response. The resource inventory identifying both assets and vulnerabilities. The watercolor series processing emotional aspects of betrayal and recovery. These supplementary materials wouldn't be presented during proceedings, but informed my internal preparation, reminders of the journey already navigated and the clarity already achieved. They represented the integration of emotional processing with strategic planning, the acknowledgement that effective negotiation required both analytical precision and psychological resilience. That evening, I met with Dr. Sonia Martinez, the psychologist I had been consulting since shortly after discovering Richard's betrayal. Unlike traditional therapy focused primarily on emotional processing, our work together emphasized practical application of psychological insights to concrete decision-making and behavior modification. Tomorrow represents significant closure. Opportunity, Dr. Martinez observed after I described the upcoming settlement conference. How are you approaching the potential emotional dimensions beyond the legal technicalities? I've prepared for various psychological tactics based on Richard's established patterns, I explained. The photograph delivery suggests emotional manipulation attempts will feature prominently. Jessica anticipates new evidence claims designed to create uncertainty and pressure concessions. I'm focusing on maintaining consistent boundaries regardless of specific approaches. And if the proceedings conclude with final agreement rather than continued negotiation, have you considered your response to formal closure after months of procedural extension? The question highlighted an aspect I had not fully explored: my reaction to resolution after extended process. While I had prepared thoroughly for continuing conflict, I had given less attention to the psychological implications of actual conclusion. I've been operating in responsive mode for so long that I haven't fully contemplated the transition to self-directed initiative, I acknowledged. There's comfort in having external circumstances dictating necessary responses. Complete freedom to determine direction without reference to opposition creates different psychological challenges. That's exceptionally insightful, Dr. Martinez noted. Many clients focus exclusively on achieving resolution without preparing for the identity recalibration that follows. The experimental mindset you've been developing provides valuable framework for that transition, approaching post-divorce identity as exploration rather than performance, embracing iterative development rather than predetermined outcomes. Our conversation shifted to specific approaches for navigating the psychological transition from opposition-focused response to self-directed creation. Rather than developing comprehensive plans for post-divorce life, we identified small experiments that would provide information about authentic preferences without requiring premature commitment, short-term travel to potential relocation destinations, project collaboration with various professional and creative partners, exploration of community involvement through time-limited commitments. The key distinction of the experimental mindset isn't absence of planning, but rather planning for learning rather than planning for certainty, Dr. Martinez summarized. Each experiment generates information that informs subsequent choices rather than succeeding or failing against predetermined metrics. This framework provided valuable structure for approaching both tomorrow's settlement conference and the broader life transition it represented. The legal proceedings would constitute one significant experiment among many, generating information about my capacity for boundary maintenance, Richard's response to formal consequences, and the legal system's effectiveness in addressing relationship dissolution. That night, I engaged in final preparation through an integration practice developed during recent months. After reviewing legal documentation and settlement parameters with rigorous analytical focus, I transitioned to the sunroom studio space for complementary creative processing. Using charcoal on large-format paper, I created abstract representations of the emotional landscape surrounding tomorrow's proceedings, not to indulge emotional reactivity, but to acknowledge its presence while establishing appropriate containment. The resulting images expressed complex emotional content that defied verbal articulation, residual anger at betrayal existing alongside relief about approaching resolution, lingering sadness about relationship potential coexisting with excitement about future possibilities, appropriate caution regarding Richard's manipulations balanced with confidence in my established boundaries. This integrated preparation, analytical documentation review alongside emotional processing through creative expression exemplified the experimental mindset I had been cultivating. Rather than compartmentalizing intellectual and emotional dimensions as during my marriage, I was developing approaches that honored both aspects simultaneously, creating more robust preparation than either component could provide independently. The morning of the settlement conference arrived with unexpected serenity rather than anticipatory anxiety. The comprehensive preparation across multiple dimensions, legal documentation, psychological readiness, emotional processing, physical well-being through adequate rest and nutrition, created foundation for approaching the proceedings with appropriate seriousness without disproportionate stress response. Jessica greeted me at the courthouse with characteristic directness. Richard and his attorney arrived early and requested private conference room access before proceedings. Standard intimidation setup. We'll proceed directly to the main conference room and maintain position until meaningful proposals emerge. Her assessment aligned with my expectations based on Richard's established patterns. The early arrival, space claiming, and preemptive positioning reflected his consistent approach to perceived power dynamics, creating artificial advantages through procedural manipulation rather than substantive contribution. Has he specified the alleged new evidence yet? I asked as we walked toward the conference room. Nothing concrete. His attorney mentioned significant financial documentation without providing specifics. Classic manufactured uncertainty technique. Entering the conference room, I immediately noticed Richard's strategic seating choice, positioning himself directly across from the door to maximize visual impact upon my arrival. His appearance reflected deliberate presentation management, expensive, but subdued suit suggesting appropriate seriousness, subtle styling changes creating younger appearance, facial expression calibrated to communicate remorse without weakness. The calculated nature of these presentation elements would have once influenced my emotional response, triggering either defensive withdrawal or conciliatory engagement. Today, I simply registered the manipulation attempts as informational data, points rather than effective influence tactics. The experimental mindset allowed observation without reactive response, Curiosity without vulnerability to manipulation. Good morning, I greeted both Richard and his attorney with professional courtesy, my tone neither aggressive nor accommodating, but simply appropriate to the formal proceedings. Taking my seat beside Jessica, I maintained neutral eye contact, without either avoiding connection or inviting emotional engagement. As his attorney began presenting their revised settlement proposals, I maintained awareness of both the technical content under discussion and the psychological dynamics attempting to influence its reception. The new evidence predictably materialized as reinterpreted financial projections rather than factual revelations. The settlement terms contained calculated emotional triggers alongside technical provisions, and Richard's nonverbal communication attempted to establish connection through familiar patterns from our relationship history. Throughout the proceedings, I applied the experimental mindset that had emerged through my transformation journey, approaching each manipulation attempt with curious observation rather than reactive response, evaluating proposals based on objective alignment with established priorities rather than emotional resonance, and maintaining consistent boundaries regardless of tactical approach variations. By early afternoon, the fundamental reality had become clear to all participants. Richard's position lacked substantive leverage beyond psychological manipulation attempts that were proving ineffective against my established boundaries. As this recognition solidified, his attorney's approach shifted from aggressive demands to damage limitation, from position advancement to graceful retreat management. The settlement terms finalized by late afternoon reflected this reality. Property division acknowledging the house as my separate asset, financial distribution accounting for documented contribution disparities, and future contact limitations. Establishing appropriate boundaries. While not achieving every theoretical advantage possible through continued litigation, the resolution provided sufficient clarity and closure to support focus shift from past management to future creation. As we concluded the formal proceedings, Richard attempted one final manipulation, requesting private conversation without attorney presence to address personal aspects beyond legal technicalities. The approach represented classic boundary testing, seeking engagement outside established protective structures to enable unmediated influence attempts. All relevant matters have been addressed through appropriate channels, I responded with composed clarity. I wish you well moving forward. The brief exchange represented perfect crystallization of the experimental mindset that had developed through my transformation journey. Rather than either engaging with the manipulation attempt or reacting defensively against it, I had maintained appropriate boundaries while acknowledging the relationship conclusion with neither hostility nor artificial amicability. Walking from the courthouse with Jessica, I experienced not the emotional catharsis often portrayed in divorce narratives, but rather quiet confirmation of growth already achieved. The settlement conference had not created transformation, but simply revealed its extent, demonstrating that the experimental mindset developed through daily practice had become sufficiently integrated to withstand high-stress application. You've changed significantly since our first consultation, Jessica observed as we reached the parking structure. Most clients either maintain anger that compromises strategic thinking or seek premature resolution that undermines appropriate boundaries. You've achieved unusual integration of emotional processing and tactical effectiveness. The experimental mindset has been transformative, I acknowledged, approaching each situation as information generation rather than performance evaluation creates entirely different response options. Richard's manipulations become data points rather than emotional triggers when viewed through that framework. As I drove home, to the suburban house that would soon be sold, making space for the downtown loft still under inspection, I reflected on the broader implications of this mindset shift. Beyond facilitating divorce navigation, the experimental approach had created foundation for sustainable transformation across life dimensions: professional development, creative expression, relationship patterns, environmental preferences, and personal identity. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.